Hello, welcome to EPG Pathshala. My name is Dr. Gayatri Arun Kumar and I am going to talk today about Module 2 in Moral Psychology, that is Nature and Conduct of Passions from the Moral Perspective. We will begin with an introduction to emotions, followed by the nature of emotions, under which we talk about neuroscience and emotion, and then the phenomenological component, then the perceptual component, followed by the evaluative and motivational components. Next is the functional components and communicative components. The next element is the role of emotions in moral psychology, which will be followed by theories of emotions, then empathy as an emotion, the empathy altruism link. The learning objectives of this particular module are as follows. 1. To understand the nature of emotions in psychology. 2. To get a perspective of the role of emotions in moral psychology. The key words to note in module 2 are emotions, components, and the relationship with morality. I will now begin with the introduction to emotions. Emotions are complex mental states present in all human beings. Ekman in 2007 identified basic emotions that are universal: surprise, disgust, fear, anger, joy, sadness, and contempt. These emotions are arguably basic because they are culturally universal. An interesting element of these basic emotions is to notice that only one is clearly positive, that is joy, and only one is clearly neutral, surprise. The other 5 are arguably negative or at least ambivalent. Humans apparently have more negative than positive basic emotions. The nature and conduct of emotions is rather complex, having several correlates setting the stage for their role in moral psychology. First one is to deal with neuroscience and emotions. To begin with, emotions by their very nature have a physiological, neural, and hormonal underpinnings. There have been several research investigations on the neuroscience of emotions. For example, studies on facial expressions, characteristics of emotions, which include both biological fitness, gaping in disgust to expel poisons and pathogens, and the communicative effectiveness, flashing anger to signal you are not to be trifled with. Of such emotions, Stepper and Strack in 1993 studied the bidirectional feedback between the central and peripheral nervous system on emotions. For instance, when you feel proud, you adopt an upright pose, but adopting the posture independently can also make you feel proud. Filippo et al. 2002 found there are breathing patterns distinctive of someone who is experiencing joy, anger, sadness, and fear. Phenomenological component of emotions. Emotions have something called phenomenological components. Phenomenology refers to what it feels like to have a given experience or to be in a given state. Emotions also have a phenomenological character. There is something it feels like to have an emotion. The more intense an emotion, the stronger the characteristic feeling. The phenomenological components are connected to states of both the nervous system, central as well as the peripheral, and the body periphery. We feel the nausea of disgust in our visceria. We feel fluttering of fear in our hearts. We feel the condensation of contempt in our sneers. All our emotions at a very basic level also have a valence. Joy is positive, disgust is negative. In addition, emotions have a felt degree of agency. The angry person feels ready to act. The sad one has a muted response. The next is the perceptual component of emotions. Emotions also have perceptual components. We perceive with our senses. For example, raindrops on the car window, scraping of a chair across the floor. Emotions too are ways of perceiving. Surprise is our way of perceiving novelty. Disgust is our way of registering impurity. Fear is a way of perceiving threats. Anger is our way of registering offenses. And sadness is our way of perceiving losses, and so on and so forth. Emotions also put us in a frame of mind that facilitates noticing and construing things as relevant to the emotion or irrelevant and ignoring to some extent all else. Someone in the grip of contempt is quick to spot further embarrassing things about his victim and of others. Someone in the throes of joy is somewhat immune to or oblivious to losses and offenses. Next one is the evaluative and motivational components. Emotions, to begin with, have an evaluative component. We can evaluate things by judging that they are right or wrong, good or bad. Like judgments, emotions involve evaluation. To be joyful over something is, among other things, to be evaluating it as good. To feel contempt towards someone, among other things, is to evaluate him as bad. Emotions also have a motivational component. An angry person feels the urge to put things right, throw down the perpetrator. This seems to be connected with both the social and the neuroendocrinological aspects of anger, specifically with the secretion of the testosterone and cortisol hormones in the face of unstable social hierarchies. A lot of this research was done by Denson et al. In 2013 and also by Hamilton et al. In 2015. Emotions typically motivate action. There is an action component here. A disgusted person is driven to cleanse herself, to ward off or expunge the offending object or persons. A fearful person feels the need to flee, flight or freeze in place. The next is the representational component. Emotions, in addition, have representational components. These representations connect the perceptual components with the motivational components. Fear is the perception of a threat. By representing the threatening object, the agent is able to direct his or her motivation to free from it in particular. Disgust is the perception of impurity or corruption. By representing the corrupt object, the agent or the individual is able to direct his desire to purify or expunge it in particular. Representations may not always succeed in their task, leading an angry person to kick his dog rather than oppose the fraudster. But in many normal circumstances, they facilitate smooth connections between our perception and motivations. The next element of emotion is the functional components. Emotions have functional components as they prepare us to act more effectively in the way that they motivate us in the first place. The heart rate increases during fear, which mobilizes glucose and oxygen to the muscle tissues. This enables the fearful person to run away faster and potentially to escape. The gaping expression characteristic of disgust is identical to the first stage of vomit, helping the disgusted person to eject impurities from their mouth. Communicative components of emotions. The last and final component is the communicative component, a special case of their functionality. Expressions of these basic emotions are nearly universal. People from around the world and different cultures express the same emotions in very similar ways. This may be because, although emotional expressions can be mimicked, their gross contours are evolutionary and adaptive. For instance, the facial expression characteristic of fear enlarges the visual field, speeds up eye movement, targets the localization, and increases nasal volume and air velocity while breathing in. In contrast, the facial expression characteristic of disgust does just the opposite. Furthermore, it is hard to suppress the facial expression of an emotion that you occurrently feel, and mimicking the facial expression tends to induce at least a twinge of the emotion itself. Thus far, it can be seen that emotions are so complex, they have many roles to play in moral psychology. Role of emotions in moral psychology. An initial approach would be first to define morality, and then to say that moral emotions are the emotions that respond to moral violations or that motivates moral behavior. There have been generally two approaches taken by philosophers to define moral emotion. The first one is to specify the formal conditions that make a moral statement. For example, that is prescriptive, that is universalizable, such as expedience. The first approach is more tied to language and the definitions we give to moral emotions. The second approach is to specify the material conditions of a moral issue. For example, that moral rules and judgments must bear on the interest or welfare either of a society as a whole or at least of persons other than the judge or agent. This definition seems to be more action based. It focuses on the outcome of a moral emotion. The second definition is more preferred because it is not tied to language and therefore can be applied to pre-linguistic children and animals. Moral emotions are emotions that are linked to the interests or welfare either of society as a whole or at least persons other than the judge or agent. There is a debate whether there is a set of basic emotions or if there are scripts or set of components that can be mixed and matched, allowing for a very large number of possible emotions. Even those arguing for a basic set acknowledge that there are many variants of each emotion. Ekman in 1992 calls these variants families. The principal moral emotions can be divided into two large and two small joint families. The large families are the other condemning family, to which the brothers are contempt, anger and disgust, and their many offspring such as indignation and loathing. And the self-conscious family, shame, embarrassment and guilt. The two smaller families, the other suffering family, compassion and the other praising family, gratitude and elevation. Hate also leaves theoretical room for cultural specificities. Different cultures, hate suggests, can formulate different local moral emotions that reflect the intrinsic values of that culture. For example, Eastern cultures may be more inclined to consider serenity or calmness as a moral emotion than Western cultures. The next, theories of emotions. There are several theories of emotions formulated in psychology. Roseanne et al. 1999 proposed the contempt, anger, disgust model. They believe that contempt tracks violations of social hierarchy, anger tracks harms, and disgust tracks violations of purity. Haid in 2001, in a social intuitionist model, suggested that people's automatic emotional reactions determine whether they judge something morally right or wrong, and they tend to confabulate reasons after that to justify or rationalize these judgments. The main way moral judgments change is through social emotional contagion, not reasoning. Haid argues that the studies of moral reasoning in moral psychology have done very little to determine what it is that leads us to action. Haid criticizes the field's avoidance of emotion and believes that it is emotion that drives us to act. As Haid would suggest, the higher the emotionality of a moral agent, the more likely they are to act morally. Graham and al. 2009, in his moral foundation theory, expands on the contempt, anger, disgust model by positioning 5 main foundations which are differently tracked by distinct emotions: care or harm, fairness or cheating, loyalty, betrayal, authority, subversion, and sanctity or degradation. Another view came from Gray et al.'s harm hypothesis. According to the harm hypothesis, the prototype of all moral situations is the agent-patient dyad in which the former harms the latter. It can be thus seen from the above theories presented that emotions have a significant role to play in moral psychology. Next topic is empathy as an emotion. Empathy is another important correlate of emotions relevant to the current discussion on moral psychology. Empathy is the experience of understanding another person's condition from their perspective. You place yourself in their shoes and feel what they are feeling. Empathy is known to increase pro-social or altruistic, that is, helping behaviors. Empathy shapes the landscape of our moral and social lives. It motivates pro-social and caregiving behaviors, plays a role in inhibiting aggression, and facilitates cooperation between members of a similar social group. Next topic is the empathy-altruism link. Empathy also plays a large role in altruism. The empathy-altruism hypothesis states that the feelings of empathy for another leads an altruistic motivation to help that person. In contrast, there also may be an egoistic motivation to help another person in need. This is a tension reduction model in which personal distress caused by another in need leads the person to help in order to alleviate their own discomfort. Batson, Klein, Heiberger and Shaw in 1995 conducted experiments where they manipulated people through the use of empathy-induced altruism to make decisions that require them to show partiality to one individual over another. The first experiment involved a participant from each group to choose someone to experience a positive or negative task. The groups included a non-communication, communication, low empathy, and communication, high empathy conditions. These groups were asked to make their decisions based on these standards, resulting in the communications leads to high empathy group showing more partiality in the experiment than the other groups due to being successfully manipulated emotionally. These individuals who successfully manipulated reported that despite feeling compelled in the moment to social partiality, they still felt they had more immoral decisions since they followed an empathy-based emotion rather than adhering to a justice perspective of morality. Empathy-induced altruism and justice are two independent pro-social motives, each with their own unique ultimate goal. Empathy-induced altruism and justice morality can work together in situations where empathy is felt towards the victim of injustice. A neuroscientist, John Dessetti, in 2015, drawing on empirical research in developmental psychology, social neuroscience, and psychopathy, argued that empathy and morality are neither systematically opposed to one another nor inevitably complementary. Empathy shapes the landscape of our moral and social lives. It motivates pro-social and caregiving behaviors, plays a role in inhibiting aggression, and facilitates cooperation between members of a similar social group. Thus, empathy is often conceived as a driving motivation of moral behavior and justice, and as such, everyone would think that it should be cultivated. However, the relations between empathy, morality, and justice are exceedingly complex. As we can see, moral emotions is the complex interplay of emotions that respond to moral violations or motivate moral behavior. In addition, moral emotions are emotions that are linked to the interest or welfare either of society as a whole or at least of persons other than the judge or the agent. Thank you.